If any game demonstrates the failure of the Game Awards of 2023, it's Alan Woke 2. Because, we all know Baldur's Gate 3 is bad. That's been talked about to death. We all know that Spider-Man 2 is a failure. We all know that Hogwarts Legacy wasn't even nominated. Starfield fell off the map. There were so many massive L's in regards to the Game Awards that it's really easy to forget that the runner-up of the night was supposedly Alan Woke 2. Supposedly. Like, it won all these awards. It was shilled. It was heavily promoted. Game journals were gushing about it. Like, oh, it's so good. It's about a writer who can't write, which is the single worst cliche a writer can come up with. Like, come on. Come on, bro. Whenever I see that in anything, I'm just kind of like, oh, you. But yeah, Alan Wake was always bad. It was never good. It was always overhyped, always shilled by game journals. It never had anything going for it, but it was shilled anyway to a ludicrous degrees, almost as bad as Baldur's Gate 3. Almost. But it's interesting in this specific instance how clearly the cracks were defined. With Baldur's Gate 3, people do this thing where they're just like, oh, all the problems with the game, that was entirely on Wizards of the Coast. They fired all these people, and Larian weren't fired from the project. They just left of their own accord. And Swin owns 70% of the company. And they do all this all these weird gaslighting tactics to get you to ignore the fact that Baldur's Gate 3 isn't very good. Right? They ignore all the very real issues with Baldur's Gate 3 just to hype it up as the greatest game ever. With Alan Woke 2, right from the get-go, people were pointing out the fact that this isn't very good. Right? People were pointing out the fact that the studio behind it doesn't have a good track record. Game journalists love it because it pushes political messaging. People knew about the Sweet Baby Incorporated involvement. People knew about the protagonist shift. They knew about everything the developers were trying to pull with this one, and as a result, the game never caught on. And it's interesting to see a year later, just how badly this game did, right? This game was not successful. And that's also true for Baldur's Gate 3, right? We know that, it didn't sell, the tens of millions of copies it was purported to have sold. But, Alan Wake 2, we have, more solid figures. And they're not impressive. Considering how much the game was shilled and how, high the budget must have been, they did not make their money back at all. And I said the same thing about their previous game, Control. It really feels as if this specific studio is a byproduct of the DEI, woke, Sweet Baby, shilling campaign. Right? There's nothing organic about this company or about its popularity. It's entirely an attempt at trying to get people to buy into woke propaganda, basically. And it's not working, right? There were a handful of people who were, enthusiastic about Alan Wake 2, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't a very good product, right? It didn't get an audience. It didn't sell. It completely bombed. And I'm very curious to see just if anyone's going to figure this out, or if the game is just going to languish in obscurity. At the very least, we can safely say that you can't just bring back a dead IP after 15 years and expect it to do gangbusters, right? You can't just expect gamers to get excited about OMG Alan Wake 2. I love playing the first one on my Xbox 360. I love losing all of my items in between. I love the lighting system. Again, who in their right mind would call Alan Wake some kind of forgotten Xbox 360 classic? Who cares? Right? Alan Wake 2 was not impressive when it came out. It's not impressive now. It is a complete disaster. And why exactly were we expected to be excited about Alan Wake 2? I remember when it was hyped, when it was first shown off, hyped at the Game Awards, and even now I think like there are people who will try to like do this thing where like, well, I never played Alan Wake 2, but I heard it was good. You know, I heard Angry Joe do that. Like, it's time to stop. Okay, like it really is time to acknowledge that like the Western third-party gaming industry, you know, the people behind the Dooms, the Starfields, the Baldur's Gate 3, like there is basically nothing coming from like the major gaming studios. Like nothing good I've seen, right? You know, the best Western game I've played recently is like A Plague Tale. And I have no idea when that one came out, and even that game has a ton of problems, right? You know, like I like A Plague Tale. I do. But there's no denying that there's definitely a lot of issues with it. And again, Western game developers don't seem to know how to make good video games. And I think Alan Wake 2 is a really good example of that. You know, all of the Game of the Year awards that weren't from Nintendo, like, demonstrated that very well. None of those games were any good. Like, none of them, other than The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Like, what exactly did Starfield do that deserves such praise? You know, what exactly did Spider-Man 2 do? Like, what exactly was so good about Baldur's Gate 3? Like, again, I've never, there really is nothing, like, really propping up these games. Aside from, like, a corrupt gaming press that wants you to talk about games that nobody talks about or plays. Right? I had to go through a year of people trying to trick you, to gaslight you into thinking that, like, nobody's playing Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Nobody's playing The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. You know, even though those games were, like, giga hits right out of the gate, right? You know, like, even though those games were massively successful and popular, right? I have come out and called, like, Super Mario Bros. Wonder my favorite 2D Mario game ever, right? Like, I've gone that far in, like, talking about how much I love these games. And yet, like, you still have, like, the community just kind of doing this thing where they're just like, nope, 2D games don't matter. Nobody plays 2D platformers. Nobody wanted a Breath of the Wild sequel in the same setting. Like, it's just completely tone deaf and completely out of touch with what people actually want, right? Like, if they really think that, like, Tears of the Kingdom is going to just fall off the map just because they said it's going to, like, they have another thing coming. If they think Mario Wonder is just going to be forgotten about, they're going to have another thing coming. If they think Metroid Prime 4 is going to, like, come out and be forgotten, they're going to have it coming, right? They are not going to be able to prop up Alan Wake 2 against everything that Nintendo's putting out in the near future, right? There is absolutely no way that they can gaslight anybody into thinking Alan Wake 2 is better than Zelda or Mario.